I'm an Ohio police officer, and I found a man's arm hanging from a tree in our latest Bigfoot case, and it's impossible to explain how it got there. This isn't your typical missing person case. This is a Bigfoot case that breaks every rule of logic me and my officers thought we knew. When I discovered what Bigfoot actually did to the man this arm belongs to, it made me realize he is capable of far darker things than we first thought. On Saturday, October 19th, 2025, I pulled my cruiser off a gravel access road deep inside Wayne National Forest in Vinton County, Ohio, just before 9 in the morning, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet the search party had gone. 20-some volunteers stood in a loose half circle around a white oak tree, every one of them looking straight up, and nobody was saying a word. I had been a deputy for 11 years by then, and I had never seen a search crew go silent like that. I got out, walked up through the wet leaves, and followed their eyes to a branch about 20 feet off the ground. A human arm was wedged into the fork of that tree, torn off at the shoulder, and there was almost no blood on the bark beneath it. Standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 60 yards back in the fog, something absolutely massive shifted between two hemlocks and was gone before I could get a clean look. One of the older volunteers, a retired forestry worker named Hollis, said under his breath that it looked like Bigfoot country out here, and I remember laughing it off because I did not yet know how right he was. I did not believe in Sasquatches on that Saturday morning. I believed in evidence, chain of custody, and the fact that men do not climb 60-foot oaks holding a severed limb just to plant it for a joke. I radioed dispatch, told them we had a body part and needed the coroner out to the site, and I told myself the shape at the tree line had been a bear or a big man in dark clothing or nothing at all. None of us had any idea that we were walking into the strangest case Vinton County had ever handled, and that the name Bigfoot would end up in my personal notes, whether my official report allowed it or not. The missing man was named Russell Cade, 34 years old, a warehouse supervisor from Logan who liked to hike alone on his days off. His wife told us he left the house around 6:30 that Friday morning with a day pack, 2 bottles of water, and a folding knife, planning to hike a loop trail off Route 356 that cut through a remote section of the National Forest. He told her he would be back by 6 that evening for dinner. When 6 o'clock came and went, she called his cell phone 11 times. It went straight to voicemail every time. By 8:30, she was on the phone with our dispatch, and I caught the call at the tail end of my shift. I have handled overdue hiker calls before, and most of them end the same way, with an embarrassed adult walking out of the woods a few hours late with a dead phone battery and a twisted ankle. I did not think Russell Cade's case would be any different. I put together a basic search plan with 2 other deputies and 4 volunteer firefighters, and we started at the trailhead where his truck was parked, an older green Ford Ranger with the doors locked and his wallet sitting in plain view on the passenger seat. That detail bothered me more than I let on, because most guys who plan on a long hike do not leave their wallet behind. Bigfoot was not on my mind yet, not even a little, but Russell Cade's truck sitting there untouched in the dark was the first small sign that this search was not going to be routine. We worked the obvious trail first, calling his name every 50 yards, checking side paths and drainage ditches where a fallen hiker might land. The forest that night gave us nothing. No torn clothing, no dropped gear, no footprints in the soft mud along the creek crossing. By midnight, we called off the search until daylight, and I drove home with a bad feeling I could not explain, the kind that sits behind your ribs and will not let you sleep. I feel like something waste watching me. None of us had any idea that by the next afternoon, the case would stop looking like a missing person and start looking like something out of a nightmare that had Bigfoot written all over it. We were back at First Light on Saturday with nearly 30 volunteers, search dogs, and a grid pattern that covered almost a full square mile of forest. Around 8:40, a volunteer named Denny Ruiz was working the eastern edge of the grid when he stopped walking and stared straight up into the canopy. He called out that he saw something pale hanging in the branches of a big white oak, and within 2 minutes, half the search team was standing under that tree with him. That is the scene I walked into a few minutes later, and once I got close enough to see it clearly, there was no mistaking what it was. A human arm, severed cleanly through the shoulder joint, was jammed into a fork of branches roughly 20 feet above the forest floor. I have processed violent crime scenes before, car wrecks and shootings, and one bad chainsaw accident, and every single one of them had blood everywhere. This scene did not. There was a small dark stain on the bark directly under the arm, maybe the size of a dinner plate, and nothing else. No blood trail leading to the tree, no drag marks in the leaves, no broken branches at the base that would explain how somebody climbed up there. The coroner's investigator arrived by 10 o'clock and confirmed what I already suspected, that the limb had likely been separated from the body by something other than a blade, based on the tearing pattern at the joint. Fingerprints taken later that afternoon confirmed the arm belonged to Russell Cade. That single piece of evidence turned our missing person search into a homicide recovery in the space of about 20 minutes. I remember standing under that tree, looking up at that arm swaying slightly in the breeze, and thinking that no human being alive could have put it there without ropes, a ladder, or serious climbing gear, none of which we found anywhere near the site. Hollis, the retired forestry worker, said it again, quieter this time, that only one kind of animal in these hills was strong enough and tall enough to leave something 20 feet up a tree without leaving a mark on the trunk. I still was not ready to say Bigfoot out loud to my sergeant, but I would be saying it plenty before this case was finished. While our search teams fanned out from the discovery tree, a deer hunter named Walt Feeney was hunkered down in a small hunting cabin about a mile and a half northwest of us, completely unaware of what we had found. Walt had rented the cabin for the weekend, a plain one-room structure with a wood stove and a single window, and he planned to still hunt the ridge above it at first light on Sunday. Around midday Saturday, Walt told me later, he heard something knock against the outside wall of the cabin. 3 deliberate raps, evenly spaced, like a person's knuckles on wood. He figured another hunter was messing with him, trying to scare game his direction or just being a nuisance, and he hollered out that he was in there and to knock it off. The knocking stopped for a few minutes and then started again on the opposite wall, and this time it was harder, more like a fist than knuckles. Walt grabbed his rifle and stepped outside to confront whoever was pulling the prank, but the clearing around the cabin was empty. He told me he walked a full circle around the structure and found nothing. No footprints in the leaf litter near the walls, which struck him as odd at the time, but not alarming. He went back inside, propped a chair against the door out of habit, and chalked the whole thing up to some other hunter trying to run him off a good stand location. He had no idea that Bigfoot was almost certainly the one testing the walls of his cabin, circling him the way a predator circles something it has not decided whether to bother with yet. None of us knew about Walt's cabin that Saturday afternoon, because he never called it in. He was annoyed, not scared, and annoyed men do not dial 911 over some knocking. It would be days before I connected what happened to him with everything else this case would throw at me. But looking back now, I believe Walt Feeney was the first living person that weekend to have Bigfoot standing within arm's reach of him and not know it. By Saturday afternoon, I had expanded the search radius out to nearly 2 miles from the discovery tree, bringing in a second K9 team and a drone operator from the County Emergency Management Office. Over the next several hours, searchers began finding pieces of Russell Cade's gear scattered across an area far too wide for any human killer to have covered on foot while also carrying a body. His day pack turned up nearly 400 yards from the tree, torn open with the contents dumped rather than removed. One of his hiking boots was found wedged into the crotch of a different tree entirely, this one over 30 feet up, higher than the arm had been. Finding the boot should have made me feel closer to an answer. Instead, it made the arm even harder to explain. Whoever, or whatever, had done this wasn't just throwing things randomly. But this Bigfoot case is just the beginning of discoveries about the Sasquatch that are absolutely mind-blowing. If you want to learn the actual truth about the Sasquatch, you can read my ebook at the top of the description of this video. Read at your own risk. Now back to the case. What really stopped the search cold was the footprints we didn't attribute to Bigfoot that time. Near 3 separate evidence sites, our team found impressions in the soft creek bank mud that measured close to 16 inches long and roughly 7 inches across at the widest point, with a stride length between prints of nearly 6 feet. I have hunted this county my whole life, and I know black bear tracks, and these were not that. They were flat-footed, 5-toed, and pressed nearly 2 inches deep into ground that had not held a boot print from any of us any deeper than half an inch. Alongside several of the tracks, saplings as thick as my wrist had been snapped clean in half at chest height, not chewed or rubbed the way a buck's antlers would leave marks, but broken with raw force. I stood at the base of that 30-foot tree, holding Russell Cade's boot in an evidence bag, looking at a footprint 16 inches long in the mud beside me, and I could not construct a single scenario, human or otherwise, that explained how the boot and the tracks belonged to the same story. Something that left prints on the ground 30 feet from a boot lodged in a canopy had no business connecting the two, not unless I was missing something about it I had not yet let myself imagine. None of us said the word Bigfoot out loud to the press that day, but I was starting to believe Hollis had been right from the very first hour. Sunday morning brought the rest of Russell Cade's remains, spread across the forest in pieces that made the medical examiner's job nearly impossible. Search dogs alerted on a torso around 7:15 found roughly 600 yards southeast of the original tree, lodged between two boulders in a way that looked almost deliberate, as though something had wanted it hidden but not buried. The chest cavity showed massive blunt trauma, ribs shattered inward rather than outward, which the medical examiner later told me was more consistent with being crushed or struck by tremendous force than with any bladed weapon. One leg turned up that afternoon near a creek crossing about a quarter-mile from the torso, the flesh stripped in long, uneven patterns that did not match any predator bite radius our wildlife officer had ever documented. Not coyote, not black bear, nothing on file. We searched for the head for 2 more full days before a volunteer found it Tuesday morning, tucked into a hollow at the base of a dead sycamore, nearly a mile from every other piece we had recovered. An arm and both hands were never found at all, and to this day they remain missing from the case file. The medical examiner sat across the table from me a week later. The autopsy report opened between us and told me flatly that she could not reconstruct a confident sequence of events. She had never seen a set of remains distributed across such distance, at such heights, with such uneven force applied to different parts of the body, and she said as much in writing, careful not to speculate beyond what the tissue could tell her. I remember driving home that night thinking about Bigfoot again, about something strong enough to pull a man apart and then carry the pieces for the better part of a mile just to leave them scattered like a cat leaves half a mouse on a porch step. And I did not sleep well for the second time that week. Walt Feeney told me later that he almost packed up and drove home Saturday night after the knocking, but stubbornness kept him in that cabin through Sunday, still convinced some other hunter was trying to run him off a good stand. Around 11 that night, and the single window black with forest dark, he heard something drag slowly across the roof above him, a long, scraping weight that moved from one end of the cabin to the other and back again, twice. He grabbed his rifle a second time and called out into the dark, telling whoever it was that this was not funny anymore and that he would put a round through the wall if they did not knock it off. He had a feeling it was Bigfoot. The dragging stopped immediately, and for close to 20 minutes the cabin sat in total silence, the kind of silence that makes a man's own heartbeat sound loud in his ears. Then came a sound Walt could not explain even days later, something that struck the cabin's single window from the outside hard enough to crack the lower pane, followed instantly by 3 heavy rhythmic blows against the front door itself, each one shaking dust loose from the rafters. Walt braced his shoulder against the door from the inside, certain a grown man was trying to force his way through, and shouted that he had a rifle and was not afraid to use it. The blows stopped as suddenly as they started. He stood there with his back against that door for almost an hour, rifle across his knees, waiting for a second attempt that never came, still arguing to himself that he could be dealing with some cruel, drunk trespasser rather than Bigfoot. By the time the sun came up Sunday morning, Walt found something at the tree line 30 yards from the cabin that finally rattled him enough to leave the property without even taking his stand down first. A sapling as thick as a fence post had been snapped and jammed upright into the soft ground like a marker, bark peeled away in long strips near the break. He never called it in, never mentioned it to another soul until I tracked him down during our follow-up canvass of the area 2 weeks later. And even then, he described it as some kind of sick prank rather than what I now believe it truly was, which was Bigfoot marking territory around a den it did not want a human sharing for a second night in a row. I went back out to the forest alone on the following Thursday, technically off duty, but unable to leave the case where it sat. I told my wife I needed to walk the ground myself without a dozen other people trampling the sign, and that was true, but it was not the whole truth. I needed to see with my own eyes whether the story those footprints were telling could possibly be real. I parked at the same trailhead Russell Cade had used and picked up a set of the 16-inch tracks near the creek where we had found his leg, and I started following them west, away from every road, trail, and search grid we had used all week. The Bigfoot tracks were fresher than anything we had documented during the organized search, the edges still sharp in mud that had not yet crumbled, which told me something had walked this exact path within the last day or so. I followed the stride for close to 2 miles, watching the broken saplings get progressively larger the deeper I went. Wrist-thick trees giving way to limbs as big around as my forearm, all snapped at roughly the same height, 7 to 8 feet off the ground. Whatever was doing this stood taller than any man I had ever arrested or arm wrestled in my life, and it was leaving a trail like a plow through standing timber. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, the forest went quiet in a way that raised the hair on my arms before my brain caught up to why. No birds calling, no squirrels working through the leaf litter, nothing but my own boots and my own breathing. I had hunted this county since I was 12 years old, and I knew what a spooked woods sounded like, and this was worse than spooked. This was a woods holding its breath. I stopped walking and stood still for almost a full minute, and that was the moment I first felt, with total certainty, that something was watching me from somewhere close, and that Bigfoot was no longer a theory I was chasing on paper, but a presence standing somewhere in the trees ahead of me. I had my hand resting on my sidearm without consciously deciding to put it there, scanning the tree line in a slow arc when I heard a branch crack off to my left, heavy and deliberate, not the light snap of a deer stepping through brush. I turned toward the sound and saw Bigfoot standing between two large tulip poplars roughly 80 yards out, an upright shape well over 7 feet tall, covered in dark reddish-brown hair, shoulders wider than any man's I had ever seen, watching me without moving a muscle. I stood frozen for maybe 3 full seconds, long enough to register the outline clearly against the gray tree trunks before it took one step backward and was simply gone, swallowed by the timber without another sound. My first instinct, and I'm not proud of this, was to explain it away. I told myself it had been a shadow, a trick of the fading afternoon light through the canopy, a large man in dark hunting gear who had ducked out of sight the second he realized I had spotted him. I have interviewed enough witnesses over the years to know how badly the human mind wants to shrink something impossible down into something ordinary, and mine was doing exactly that in real time, working overtime to convince me Bigfoot had nothing to do with what I had just seen. I forced myself to walk the 80 yards to where it had been standing, and that is where the excuses stopped working. Pressed into the soft earth at the base of those two poplars was a fresh footprint, 16 inches long, 5 toes clearly defined, the same track pattern we had been following across 2 miles of forest, except this one was maybe 10 minutes old at most, the edges still crumbling slightly as I watched. There was no way a man in dark clothing left that print. I stood there with my hand still on my weapon, alone, 2 miles from my truck, with absolute proof that something enormous and upright had just been close enough to watch me from 80 yards away. What it was capable of, and how the arm ever ended up in that tree, still made no sense. I only knew now that I was standing in its country, not the other way around. I should have turned around right there and walked straight back to my truck, and any reasonable version of me knows that now. Instead, I kept following the sign, because 11 years of police work had trained me to chase evidence rather than run from it, and because some stubborn part of me needed to understand what I was dealing with before I brought this to my sergeant. About a quarter mile further west, I noticed something that stopped me cold. A second set of the same 16-inch tracks crossing directly over my own boot prints from 20 minutes earlier, meaning Bigfoot had circled behind me while I walked forward, not once, but at least twice, based on the layered impressions. I found what looked like an observation point not long after, a low rise overlooking a well-used game trail where the ground had been cleared of leaves and pressed flat in a rough seated shape, as though something large had crouched there for a long stretch of time watching the trail below. 20 yards down that same game trail, I found the remains of a white-tailed deer, an adult doe, its spine snapped and its ribcage crushed in a pattern that mirrored almost exactly what the medical examiner had described in Russell Cade's autopsy report. No gunshot, no arrow, no coyote pack could have done that kind of damage to an animal that size in one clean strike. Standing over that dead doe, I started putting together a theory I did not want to believe, that Bigfoot had likely been watching this stretch of forest for days before Russell Cade ever laced up his boots, using elevated points to track movement along the game trails, the same trails hikers like Russell tended to follow because they made for easier walking. I believed by that point that Russell had probably been stalked for some distance before whatever happened to him actually happened, the same patient, circling, silent hunting behavior I had just watched play out in miniature over the last half mile. Every new piece of evidence answered one question and created 2 more. It sat in the back of my mind the whole walk out, an answer I did not have yet. I backed away from the carcass and started retracing my own steps toward the truck, done chasing sign for the day, when a fist-sized rock struck a tree trunk less than 3 feet from my head, hard enough to bark the bark loose and rattle down the trunk in pieces. There was no wind, no loose slope above me that could explain a falling rock, and no person in sight in any direction. I turned to check. Another rock followed a few seconds later, landing short and skipping past my boots, thrown from somewhere off to my right in the thick brush. And I understood then that Bigfoot was not just watching anymore, it was testing me the same way it had tested Walt Feeney's cabin door, gauging how I would react before deciding what to do next. None of us in law enforcement had a category in our training for a predator like this, and standing in that clearing with a dead doe behind me and stones flying out of empty brush, I finally admitted to myself that the case was not going to end the way any homicide investigation normally does. I was reaching for my radio to call in my position when I heard something crash through the brush directly behind me, moving fast, and I spun around just in time to see Bigfoot break from the tree line at a dead run, closing the distance across open ground with a speed that did not match anything that size should have been capable of. There was no time to draw my sidearm and aim, no time to think through tactics, only pure animal instinct screaming at me to move. I dropped down and to my right into a shallow gully cut by runoff, using the drop in elevation and a fallen log as cover, and I felt the ground itself shudder as something enormous thundered past just a few feet above where I had been standing. In that half second it passed over me, close enough that I could have reached up and touched it. I finally got the look I had been chasing since that first morning under the oak. Its arm swung down past the lip of the gully as it crossed, and even folded at the elbow in a dead sprint. That arm alone was longer than I am tall, ending in a hand wide enough to close around a man's shoulder joint the way a normal hand closes around a doorknob. Upright, at full height, unfolded. That reach would clear 20 feet off the ground without the thing so much as leaving its heels. I understood in that instant, lying in the mud with my heart slamming against my ribs, exactly how Russell Cade's arm had ended up wedged into a fork of branches with no rope marks and no scuffed bark underneath it. Nothing had climbed that tree. Something had simply stood at the base of it and reached up. I scrambled up the far side of the gully and ran, not in a straight line, but weaving hard between trees, remembering half-buried training that told me a straight sprint favors the faster animal every time, while tight turns through timber cost a bigger body more than a smaller one. Bigfoot crashed through brush behind me the whole way, snapping limbs I could hear, breaking even over my own ragged breathing, gaining ground on the open stretches and losing it every time I cut sharply around a tree trunk. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like they belonged to somebody else, but stopping was not an option I let myself consider. Halfway across that clearing, my boot caught a root hidden under the leaf litter, and I went down hard, the impact driving the air out of my lungs and skidding my sidearm loose from its holster into the grass, somewhere out of reach. I heard Bigfoot crashing behind me close the distance in the span of a single heartbeat, close enough now that I could feel the ground itself pounding through my palms as I pushed myself back up, and I had no time to search for the weapon, only time to keep moving. I finally reached the can of bear spray clipped to my belt, twisted the safety off, and turned just enough to fire it back over my shoulder in a wide arc without breaking stride. I heard a sound behind me unlike anything I had ever heard from a wild animal, a deep, guttural, almost human-sounding roar that seemed to shake the air itself, followed by the crash of Bigfoot veering off hard to my left. I did not look back to confirm it. I just kept running, cutting toward the direction I knew the responding deputies were staged, and I did not stop moving until I could see the flashing light bars through the trees ahead of me. 2 deputies met me at the tree line and half carried me the rest of the way to the vehicles, and it took a solid 10 minutes before I could get my breathing under control enough to explain what had happened. We assembled a team of 6 and went back into the gully within the hour while there was still enough daylight to work the scene, and what we found there erased any lingering doubt in my mind. Surrounding my own boot prints in the soft gully mud were multiple 16-inch tracks, overlapping and layered in a tight radius, showing that Bigfoot had circled that exact spot from several directions before making its final charge toward me. While we worked the scene, one of the younger deputies, a guy named Pruitt, who had grown up hunting these same hills, went pale and grabbed my arm, telling me to listen. From somewhere off to the north, maybe half a mile out, came a long, low vocalization that rose and fell in pitch, nothing like a coyote's yip or a great horned owl's call, something deeper and more sustained that made every one of us stop moving at once. Bigfoot answered a second time from a different direction entirely a few minutes later, further away, as if something else out there was responding to whatever we had disturbed, and none of us said a word about what that might mean. We had cameras out within the hour, still photography gear, and a thermal-equipped drone brought in from the State Wildlife Division, and we worked that gully and the surrounding ridgeline until well past dark. We got tracks, we got broken timber, we got that recorded vocalization on somebody's cell phone, faint but audible. What we did not get in all those hours of searching with 6 trained officers and modern equipment was a single clear photograph of Bigfoot itself. It had vanished the moment backup arrived, the same way it had vanished from that tree line on the very first morning of the search, and it never showed itself to any of us again. Russell Cade was officially declared deceased 3 weeks later, with cause of death listed as undetermined due to the fragmentary and scattered condition of his remains, a phrase the medical examiner chose carefully because the honest alternative would have raised questions nobody in an official capacity was prepared to answer. My final incident report describes the search, the recovery of evidence, and the tracks we documented and photographed, but it does not include my personal encounter in the gully because there was no way to substantiate it within the framework of a homicide investigation, and I was not willing to attach my name to a claim I could not back with a photograph or a body. In 11 years of law enforcement, I closed plenty of hard cases, but Russell Cade's is the only one where I privately believe, without a shadow of a doubt, that Bigfoot was the only explanation that ever fit every single piece of evidence we found, and I am the only person alive who actually knows how that arm got 20 feet up into that oak tree without a single mark on the bark, because for 1/2 of 1 second, in a gully 2 miles from my truck, I watched the reach that put it there.